First, would everyone please listen to this video?
Due to COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted as a Zoom meeting pursuant to the provisions of the Governor's Executive Order N-2920, which suspends certain requirements of the Brown Act. This meeting is being live-streamed on the CCTA website. The chair will call upon members, staff, and other speakers by name. Please speak clearly and state your name before giving comments or remarks. Persons participating via Zoom with their cameras enabled are reminded that their activities are visible to viewers. Members participating by Zoom wishing to speak should physically raise their hand and unmute their mic when called upon. Members should remute their mics when done speaking. Citizens participating by Zoom wishing to speak should use the Raise Hand feature or dial *9 if participating via phone, and the chair or staff will call upon them at the appropriate time. Citizens will have 3 minutes to speak. A 30-second warning will be provided. After 3 minutes, staff will lower their hand and mute their mic. Participants via phone will be called upon by the last 4 digits of their phone number. It is requested that public speakers state their names and organization, but providing such information is voluntary. Written public comments received in accordance with the COVID-19 Special Notice for Public Comment Guidelines are printed on the meeting agenda. If authors of the written correspondence would like to speak, they should raise their hand and the chair will call upon them at the appropriate time. All written correspondence received after that and during the meeting will be entered into the record. A roll call vote will be taken for all action items. Thank you for participating in a meeting of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority.
Thank you. And now, Terry Ann, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Arnrich,
Here.
Commissioner Butt,
Here.
Commissioner Glover,
Here.
Commissioner Haskew,
Here.
Commissioner Hudson,
Here.
Commissioner Mitchell,
Here.
Commissioner Nowak,
Here.
Commissioner Thorpe, if he is absent, Commissioner White,
Here.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Here.
Chair Geringer,
Here.
Representative Allen, she's absent, Representative Powers,
Here.
Representative Worth,
Here.
and we also have in the audience Commissioner Alternate Fideli and Representative Foley. And I hope I didn't miss anyone else.
Thank you. And before we move into the regular part of the agenda, I wanted to make a request that we move regular agenda item number 9B, the Contra Costa Accessible Transportation Strategic Plan, to be moved up to be first on our regular agenda to allow for various consumers and other stakeholders to be able to do public comment earlier in the evening. And so I would need a motion and a second to do that.
So moved. So moved.
Second.
Who said so moved?
Newell.
Thank you, Newell. And second?
I guess I'm going to pipe in here. You're
Okay.
the chair. You can move any item on the agenda without a motion.
Okay, well, we actually yesterday, I looked into this and was advised to go ahead and have a motion and,
Okay.
but thank you.
Well, thank you for checking it out.
No, so checked it out ahead of time. We have a motion by Commissioner Arnrich and a second by Commissioner Haskew. Terry Ann, could you call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Arnrich,
Yes.
Commissioner Butt,
Yes.
Commissioner Glover,
Yes.
Commissioner Haskew,
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchell,
Yes.
Commissioner Nowak,
Yes.
Commissioner Thorpe, still absent, Commissioner White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Geringer.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously with Commissioner Thorpe absent to move the Accessible Transportation Strategic Plan item to the first regular agenda item.
Thank you. And the next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. And we have a minor change. Representative Powers is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And I don't see her on the screen, but But Representative Powers, please lead us in the pledge.
Yes, my pleasure. I pledge allegiance.
To the
Please follow me.
flag
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the
of the
United
United States of America
And to
and to
the
the republic
for
for which it stands,
one
one
nation
nation,
under God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with liberty and
and
justice,
for
and
all.
I want to emphasize for all.
Thank you. And Commissioner Arnerich is here, but was not able to be on video. So everybody keeps up with the changes. And thank you, Representative Powers. So now we move on to the section of our agenda where we allow, we invite anyone from the public who would like to speak on items that are not part of the agenda to please do so now. And you can do that by raising your hand, and either staff or I will call on you to give your public comment.
Don't see any public comment.
Yeah, I don't see any raised hands either. Thank you. So now we're moving on to our presentation, and tonight we'll have a presentation on Brown Act updates given to us by Terry Ann Grover, and Terry Ann's going to do that while admitting people. So Terry Ann, take it away.
We're going to have a brief presentation this evening. It's going to be presented by Jacob Dujensky with Beverage and Diamond. And he's just going to provide a very brief Brown Act refresher with some focus on the updated social media requirements under Assembly Bill 992. And then we'll open it up if there's any questions and answer following the presentation. So Jacob, I'll hand it over to you.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Terry. And so let me see if I can get, I prepared a brief PowerPoint presentation. I should be able to get it started here. Can you all see that?
Looks good.
Good stuff. So the Brown Act, lots of you have lots of experience with what the Brown Act is and what it requires. Others of you, not so much. You know, Terry Ann approached me about doing something similar to this, especially with regard to the updates in regard to social media and sharing of items with CCTA's subject matter jurisdiction. Noticing that we have some new faces on the board and some folks who may not have all the nooks and crannies figured out of the Brown Act. We figured we'd provide a brief update and you know, tell you all about what the new social media requirements are. So those of you that do not know, the Brown Act is essentially California's government in the sunshine law. Hence the name of today's presentation. And so what this really requires is that, you know, the people's business gets conducted in open and public meetings. The whole idea being that, well, if folks that are making decisions for people and are appointed by the people, either elected or appointed by folks that are elected, the people should have the right to at least most of the information and deliberations that those folks conduct when coming to decisions that essentially govern folks' daily lives. And so the text you see on screen here is actually taken right out of the Brown Act. There's also been more recently a constitutional amendment which essentially enshrined this into the California Constitution. So it's very important and something all folks on the board at the very least should be mindful of in their interactions with other members of the board. And so who does it govern? Legislative bodies, folks. CCTA board is a governing board of a local agency. You guys make decisions, make policy, basically are where the buck stops when it comes to contracts and other decisions that are getting made for purposes of the authority and whether or not to go out and seek any type of renewed fees or anything of that nature. You know, those are the types of legislative actions that a body would make that would make them a legislative body. But this also includes certain types of appointed bodies. So we can think of things like our RTPCs here, where they are required to hold meetings. If we have that within an ordinance and the amount of time and when those are going to be, they would also be subject to certain Brown Act requirements. And so it being an open meetings law, it generally governs meetings. What those are essentially any meeting of a majority of members of that particular legislative body. Those meetings must be open. So at the beginning of the hour, when we ask for folks, if they have anything they would like to say, members of the public, that ensures that we're having an open meeting. Another portion of that is that generally, not in the time of COVID, but in other times, if you wanted to hold a meeting, you couldn't put it in where folks might not be able to get into. You wouldn't want to force folks to have to pay an entry fee to get into. That's not really open. And so it's designed to make sure that every member of the public can participate essentially within government decision making. It's also generally limited to items that are on the agenda. This is a notice requirement essentially. So if members of the public are interested in things that are going to be discussed by the board, they can make sure to show up and make sure that their voice is heard. And so probably one of the thorniest topics when it comes to the Brown Act is the prohibition on serial meetings. What a serial meeting isn't obvious or very intuitive. But essentially it's discussing items within the subject matter jurisdiction. For us, it would be the subject matter jurisdiction of CCTA outside of an open meeting that essentially gets across to a majority of the members of the board. So you can imagine a situation where a game of telephone, where folks are discussing potentially a matter that would come up, during the next board meeting. They want to know, well, hey, how are you going to vote on it? How do you think Joe's going to vote on it? And then that conversation continues. That would be a violation of the Brown Act because that would be deliberation by members of the board without the public being involved or being able to see how that decision-making process really got borne out. And so that's not a likely scenario. Very difficult to play telephone these days. But it's very easy to forward emails. That's one thing folks don't necessarily think about, but if an email chain about a topic that's subject to the board's decision-making were to get around to a majority of the board members and there's some deliberation or discussion on that particular item, that would likely violate the serial meeting prohibition. And so with that prohibition and how tricky it is, and given the times and technology innovations that we have and the advent of social media being essentially everywhere, California legislature took it upon itself to include some requirements and some guidance with regards to social media as it relates to the Brown Act. And so as Terry Ann had alluded to earlier, this was AB 992. It was passed last year. I think it became effective on January 1 of this year, if I'm remembering correctly. But it essentially provides some ground rules aimed at the use of social media by board members or legislative body members of any stripe. And it basically dictates that, well, you can use social media, you can interact with the public. That's obviously something you want to be doing. You can get information from the public via social media. It's an easy way to interact with folks that are part of your constituency. However, you need to make sure not to be interacting with board members on social media. Open social media platforms, essentially any board member could be seeing a post. You might really like some I-680 project that Tim is proposing. Put up a brief slide or a shout out on that on your Facebook. Well, as soon as you do that, and other members of the board may like your post, or they may say, hey, I think this is great. Well, you've potentially started the beginning of a serial meeting that's prohibited by the Brown Act. And it's those types of things that are now prohibited under AB 992. So that is all I've got. I'll give you a general grounding in what the Brown Act is, what it requires, why we do some of the things that we do with regards to these meetings. And we have these new requirements as they relate to social media. But with that, I'll open it up. If any folks have any questions in general or any comments, I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Jacob. Do any members of the board have any comments or questions? And if we could, thank you. Seeing no hands raised or waving about, are there any members of the public who would like to speak? If so, please raise your hand. Okay, and again, seeing, excuse me, seeing,
comment.
what, Terry Ann, do you see any?
I don't see any comment. I just want to note that Commissioner Thorpe just arrived,
I did see that flash across. Thank
and
you.
Representative alternate peoples also just arrived.
Great, thank you. Welcome to both of you. Again, Jacob, thank you very much. It's always good to have that reminder about the Brown Act, and particularly about the changes relative to social media and email communication. So thank you again. Now we'll move on to the consent calendar. And before I ask for board changes, I just want to note that on the consent calendar, item 61 for the 2 at-large board appointments to the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, the APC held interviews and is recommending the appointment of Lamar Karimi for the representative for youth and Marjorie McWee for the representative for people with disabilities and seniors. And are there any changes or comments to the consent calendar from the board? Does anyone want to pull an item? Again, seeing no hands raised. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak to the consent calendar on any item? Terry Ann, do you see any? Okay.
No, I don't see any comments.
Thank you. May I have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved. Noack?
Noack, thank you. And a second?
Askew.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Commissioner Noack and a second by Commissioner Haskew. Terry Ann, will you call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Arnrich,
Yes.
Commissioner Butt,
Yes.
Commissioner Glover,
Yes.
Commissioner Haskew,
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchell,
Yes.
Commissioner Noack,
Yes.
Commissioner Thorpe, Commissioner Thorpe, oh, you're on mute. Oh, sorry, he just came in. I need to make him a co-host.
I saw him saying yes.
Yeah. Commissioner Thorpe should be able to unmute now. Sorry about that. Thank you. Commissioner White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Geringer,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Terry Ann. And now we'll move on to our regular agenda items. And our next item on the agenda will be an action item to discuss the draft final Contra Costa Accessible Transportation Strategic Plan, which we earlier moved to this first spot on the regular agenda calendar. And it will be introduced to us by Peter Engel.
Thank you, Chair Geringer. I really appreciate it. Good evening, commissioners. I'm very excited to bring this item to you tonight. It's been a little over a year of work to develop this strategic plan for accessible transportation. And I believe it's a monumental step forward for the county in helping to really bring together a good coalition of strong support for moving accessible transportation forward. I'm going to make a few opening remarks and then turn it over to Richard Weiner from Nelson Nygaard to give most of the presentation on the actual inner workings of the study and how it went forward. I want to thank, so CCTA worked in partnership with Contra Costa County on this study. We received a grant from Caltrans to fund the study. So I appreciate all the work that county staff and the Board of Supervisors provided with regard to doing this. I want to also thank members of both the study TAC and PAC, Policy Advisory, Technical Advisory Committee and Policy Advisory Committee, and Chair Geringer and Commissioner Hudson both were members of the Policy Advisory Committee, as well as Representative Allen from BART, but she is not at this meeting. So certainly encourage their input to the discussion tonight. John Cunningham from the county, who would typically be here to give some remarks, is not feeling well. So just to pass on from the county's perspective, their work in this. The County Board of Supervisors did take action on this item last week at their board meeting, so I would invite Supervisor and Commissioner Mitchoff to speak to that if she feels comfortable doing that. The Board of Supervisors did support the recommendations to move them forward to the authority this evening. So let me start the PowerPoint presentation here, and I will turn it over to Richard to have him start the presentation if I can find it on my screen full of crazy presentations. I think this is it.
I'll find it. Great. Thanks very much, Peter. Great. It looks like everyone can see that. Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to present to you this evening. As Peter mentioned, this is the culmination of a almost year-and-a-half long project. And I just want to say in advance, my apologies to the 4 or 5 people I see on the screen who have actually heard this presentation before last week at the Board of Supervisors meeting, but I'll see if I can make it scintillating nevertheless. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the Accessible Transportation Strategic Plan, I'll just call it the ATS plan, was intended to look at the transportation gaps faced by seniors, people with disabilities, and veterans in the county. And Peter mentioned it was a Caltrans grant. And one of the key recommendations is a coordination structure and strategies to help improve, to actually implement those strategies. This is the ultimate meeting, actually, of this project. This is the last one, and the project is intended to end in the next week and a half or so. So this is an exciting moment for all of us who have been involved. Next slide, please. Peter mentioned that there have been some previous plans. The first 3 bullets speak to some of the plans that call for coordination as being a key to trying to meet these transportation gaps. And Peter mentioned the 2 committees that we worked with very closely, the Technical Advisory Committee that provided subject matter expertise, and then the Policy Advisory Committee, some of whose members are actually in the meeting this evening. Go through to the next one. So just to be totally transparent, at the beginning of the study, there was some skepticism from people who are participating about the fact that there have been 3 studies in the last decades that try to address this issue. And while some things were recommended, some of the key findings were not implemented. And so we were very cognizant going into this effort that we didn't want to repeat the mistakes that had been made before that didn't result in implementation. From those who did participate in those studies, my understanding is that there's a much higher level of collaboration this time around, which gives us a sense of optimism about implementation, in addition to having some key champions involved on the committees to take this to the next step. So we're feeling optimistic that the key recommendations are going to be implemented. Some of the barriers to implementation, though, were worth looking at. It's very difficult, just to be realistic about this, it's very difficult to coordinate multiple agencies that are serving different populations, have different missions, are subject to different regulatory requirements, and then, of course, funding limitations. We think we're in a better environment now to actually move forward with some of these things. Next slide, please. We just included a couple of sample maps over here. This report is over 100 pages and has a whole slew of maps which really tell the story of what we were looking at in terms of how we identified the mobility gaps. This map shows you both the paratransit service areas for the 4 providers that service area. As you can see, the 680 corridor is County Connection, which is by far the largest in the county. And then East Bay Paratransit does penetrate from Alameda County into West County, in Richmond, San Pablo, as you can see in the brown on the west, Westgate and Dial-A-Ride in the northwest, and then over on the right, the light yellow color is Tri-Delta. In addition, we've got a list. It was important for us to identify as many transportation resources as are available in the county and not just see this as being a transit or paratransit study. So on the right, you see listed all the community-based transportation programs that exist in the county, and there probably are others that didn't make it to the list. Next slide, please. This map shows where the medical facilities are concentrated, primarily in the 680 corridor, as you'd expect. But this is significant when looking at the populations we're targeting in this study, that particularly in the dense areas in the west part of the county, people have major issues trying to access medical resources because of the geographic distribution of the clinics and the medical centers. So that was a key issue as part of our identification of geographic gaps. Next slide, please. So we started off just before COVID hit, and we actually did a couple of presentations in person, and then we had to pivot very dramatically. And I think most participants felt that the outreach efforts that were very comprehensive were very effective given the circumstances under which we were working. We actually were able to get a survey out with some innovative ways of trying to reach people who wouldn't necessarily be connected to an organization. So, for example, we got 500 surveys delivered with people's meals. And ultimately, we received over 1,000 responses, which was really great. Before we leave the slide, I do want to point out the map at the bottom which shows where the survey responses were concentrated. As you can see, there's a disproportionate number of people in La Marinda and the Concord area. And so we made sure that in our other outreach efforts, we made special efforts to try and reach people in West County, for example, and East County. And the next slide, please. That included holding focus groups, for example, in San Pablo and I think El Cerrito, not actually physically in those locations, but with people who are located there, and that drew people from Richmond and Hercules, for example. So we want to make sure that West County was covered. We also had 11 in-depth stakeholder interviews with individuals who had a lot to offer about their particular areas of expertise. This was a new experience for us, doing a telephone town hall meeting. We did this based on the experience in the county, which had been very successful with us. And indeed, we had this town hall. Over 1,100 people participated. It was in English, Spanish, and Mandarin. And we asked people a bunch of questions. And so we were really pleased with that wasn't just an opportunity to hear from people, but really to educate them about the study so that it's in people's consciousness, thinking with a view ahead when there's another sales tax measure that comes up, we'll be spreading the word about some of the work that's being done in the county. Anyway, this was advertised in the partner websites and also on social media. Next slide, please. Some of the key categories where we identified gaps were in fixed route service, paratransit, the community-based services. We looked at geographic and temporal inequities, time of day inequities. Affordability was a key issue. Access to essential services like dialysis clinics, medical facilities, access to information, and the overarching thing was having an organizational structure in place that can try and address some of these gaps. Next slide, please. Here are a few examples of the types of gaps that were identified. Same-day service is it's a perennial issue wherever we do paratransit work in the country, because the ADA does not require paratransit to provide same-day service. This is a huge gap for people who want to have more spontaneous mobility. Also service in the evenings and on weekends. We heard a lot, especially with the folks in the West County that we spoke to, and as was evident in the West County study that was done 3 years ago, I believe, the impact of the closure of Doctors Medical Center, very difficult for people to access facilities as a result. Although there are extensive veterans transportation programs, there are some significant limitations to those programs. Firstly, not all veterans are eligible. You have to have had an honorable discharge, for example. Also, the trips are largely limited to medical purposes, and they may not be available out of the 8 to 5 business hours. Limited service options in East County, not surprisingly, given the low density development in East County, which is very difficult to serve with transit and other public transportation. And folks in these particular groups were heavily impacted by that, the lack of availability of public transportation services. Affordability was true across the board. Generally speaking, these populations are low income. 75% of people with disabilities are unemployed, generally speaking. And seniors, there's a whole range of income levels, but veterans as well, disproportionately low income. So affordability was a key finding. And then what was identified was historically there'd been a lack of political support. And that goes back to my comment at the beginning about why some of the recommendations had not moved forward. We're feeling much more positive about that from this study moving forward. Next slide. So key recommendation was actually setting up a structure that's coordinated that will enable the implementation of our recommendations. The first one is a short-term recommendation in the first 2 to 6 months following this study, establishing a task force. It could be modeled along the PAC, but the intent of this task force is to identify strategies that can be implemented by existing agencies and without having to wait for long-term implementation of some of the strategies, and also how to define and establish this coordinated entity that's a much more long-term organizational structure, and critical to all of this, identifying funding. Second big recommendation is having a county-wide coordinating entity, which could reside in a number of different locations, whether it's nonprofit, public agency, etc. It could be a new entity. And that entity could apply for consolidated transportation service agency funds if it's appropriate. That application is made through MTC, and it's a certain amount of funding that is available for administrative purposes. Or we could look at other models for coordination. Thanks, Peter. Next slide. The mission of that coordinated entity would be firstly to identify funding sources, possibly implement county-wide paratransit eligibility, having a mobility management function, which I can elaborate on in the Q&A if necessary, having joint paratransit scheduling software, procurements, basically lobbying in Sacramento for funding, etc., as one unified voice. There is already an innovative one-seat ride program for interjurisdictional trips. I believe this is the first county in the Bay Area that has this kind of pilot. And so we could look to expand that. And then just in general, looking to see where there are opportunities for county-wide services. Next slide. Within that overall structure, there are specific strategies that I haven't mentioned yet, those that address same-day trips, expanding the volunteer driver programs that are already in existence, setting up shopping shuttles, hospital discharge service, and I can explain any of these later if necessary. Let's go on to the next slide. And so we're calling everything that's happened over the last year and a half phase one, but essentially that is the bulk of the study. Phase two, though, is really intended to maintain the opportunity for the public to be engaged and to provide input. So we have a survey that's been up for a month and a half or something like that, in which we've already gotten responses to some of these strategies. And this is being transitioned. I think as of yesterday, we closed it because we're transferring it to the county, to CCTA, in fact. But people will have an opportunity as we move into the implementation phase to give their input to us. Next slide, please. I believe this is the thank you. So I went through that pretty quickly, but Peter and I will be happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Peter, for kicking that off. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Commissioner Nowak?
I don't know if you looked more in depth into this. Obviously, you talked about funding needs, and there was a potential of a sales tax. Is this meant to look at funding within the CCTA construct, or is it sort of an independent funding mechanism? Because I think then, sort of there'll be parties fighting each other over funding potentials. So,
Peter,
yeah, let me start with that, and maybe Richard, you can either support or deny what I say. Okay. I think part of the issue that we have seen over the years with and part of it is this lack of kind of a coordination entity, is that there's funding available through lots of different agencies, federally and statewide, that may not be transportation related. They may be social service agencies or veteran related agencies that actually have funding sources for transportation. So our goal is to have a coordinated effort with all of these agencies to identify these funds and see how we can use them together and leverage each other's funds to provide a better service.
Yeah, I build on that to say we're taking very much an expansive view of funding, and this is going to be a critical task. As Peter mentioned, I think there was a federal study done a few years ago in which they identified something like 64 funding sources that weren't specifically called transportation funding sources, and yet had a component that allowed agencies to tap into those funds for transportation purposes. So thinking innovatively and out of the box and out of local funding sources is definitely going to be required in order to have some success with this.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments before I open to public comment?
Madam Chair, I did want to point out a couple things that came from the County Board of Supervisors that we thought made a lot of sense to incorporate into kind of the recommendation or the concept here. And that one was who's going to carry on kind of updating this study. I mean, these studies always get updated over years, and we would propose to put that into the coordinating entity that is developed, that they would take on the role of updating that, and then also to make sure that there was a low income representation on both the task force and the coordinating entity, which we agree with.
Thank you. And anyone else? So now I will, Terry Ann, did we receive any written public comment on this item?
No, we did not receive any written public comment.
Okay, and so I know that there are some members of the public who are here to speak to this item. If you would like to speak to the item, would you raise your hand, and either Terry Ann or I will call on you. And I do see a hand raised right away, and so I'd like to invite you to share your public comment, Debbie Toe. Terry Ann, does she need to have us unmute her?
Okay, yes. First, she wasn't going to let me. She just wanted to watch me squirm for a few minutes. So hello.
Sorry.
Welcome.
Hello, Chair Geringer and members of the board and CCTA staff and advocates. I'm happy to see Dr. Hernandez here and Jim Donnelly, and I hope some others. I think I saw Carol McCrary. So my hope is that we're talking about implementing tonight, that we are not just talking about another study, because we've done that. We've been there, we've done that. And I think the conversation that I heard at the Board of Supervisors, and I have to admit, I was on another meeting at the time and I hopped in towards the end of it, so I missed much of the discussion, but really is about, this has to be different. This has to be implemented. And in order to implement it needs some funding. And I believe that there's some Measure J funding that we've worked on years and years and years ago, actually, at the onset of my advocacy around this. And that we do need to have a nonprofit organization that can go after all these different funding pots and streams and can coordinate this person-centered transportation system. And I think we need to be bold in our efforts, and we need to implement and not just study. So I want to make that very, very clear. And I think that that's right, what Richard was saying. There is a lot more coordination, collaboration, and support to see this move forward. And it's not trying to take away from existing mandates of paratransit. It's trying to recognize that there's a continuum of transportation services that need to be in place to meet the needs of the population here. And I hope that you are bold in your recommendations about implementation, as well as how we move on, and that we make it concrete implementation steps. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Debbie. And this is an action item, just to clarify. And one of the items is authorize implementation of a recommended coordinating structure. So there's very strong language in the motion that we will entertain in just a bit. So next I see Jim Donnelly. Welcome. And Terry, and he will need to.
All right. Yeah, thank you. As a way of introduction, my name is Jim Donnelly. I'm the current president of the Advisory Council on Aging. I'm also the past chair and a member of the County Connection Advisory Committee. And I'm also a volunteer driver for Mobility Matters, right? That's a few of people as know the many things I do. I'm also on the Danville Senior Advisory Commission. So I speak with, I really have been over the last several years getting involved with senior issues. And one of the things that just hits me over and over again is the importance of transportation for our seniors and our disabled. Yeah, they hit in the same category. And I want to speak in favor of getting a coordinated committee to get something to make this strategic plan different than the efforts that have been done before. Debbie hit on it before. We've had these initiatives, we put in money, and we've never seemed to get beyond that planning stage. Now in the state, we're making a big effort with the master plan for aging to start going from talking about it to implementing it. And, you know, at the state level, there's this encouragement and this push for getting us all down at the local levels to get involved and get something done. So I'm speaking in favor of approving the recommendation, providing a coordinating committee. Let's get it going and let's move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all the work that you do in the community. And so I see Supervisor Mitchoff has her hand up. If there's anyone else who wishes to speak to this item, if you could raise your hand now so that we have a sense and we can move through these, that would be much appreciated. And Commissioner Mitchoff.
Thank you, Chair Geringer. If there is no further public comment, I would like to make the motion and put the motion on the floor. As I stated at our Board of Supervisors meeting and in agreement with Ms. Toth and Mr. Donnelly, we have studied this to death, no pun intended, and it is time to implement. And I have 2 years left on my term, and I plan to make sure that this plan is implemented before I leave office. So I move the item.
Thank you. And do we
I'll
have?
second it.
I'd second if we're talking staff's recommendation, yes.
Yes. So Commissioner Nowak, thank you. And I should have checked ahead of time. I would have been happy to also move or second this, but we now have a motion by Commissioner Mitchoff and a second by Commissioner Nowak. Is there any further discussion on the part of the board? Seeing no hands, Terry Ann, will you please call for the vote?
Commissioner Arnrich,
Yes.
Commissioner Butt,
Yes.
Commissioner Glover,
Yes.
thank you, Commissioner Haskew,
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchoff,
Yes.
Commissioner Nowak,
Yes,
Commissioner Thorpe, Commissioner Thorpe,
Aye.
thank you, Commissioner White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Geringer,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
Great. So I want to, big applause, very excited. And I want to thank Richard and Naomi and everyone from Nelson Nygaard, Peter Engel, and John Cunningham. Actually, I have a little bit of goosebumps. John Cunningham, I was going to combine Peter and John, but John Cunningham from the county. And this is very much about moving forward. And so moving forward with the task force. And as Commissioner / Supervisor Mitchoff said, there is a lot of momentum behind this, and none of us want this to be yet another study that ends up. And I think the plan and the recommendations that have been laid out allows us to do that and to not spend a lot of extra time, reinventing the wheel on how we pick a task force. And I'm also very excited and very much as I've come in to being chair, and even before this, serving on the PAC, very anxious and excited. And so this is a priority as well. So thank you to all of the stakeholders and everyone who worked on this. Let's attach and get the paperwork wrapped up with Caltrans, and let's begin the process for coming back with a plan to develop the task force. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Agree.
Agree.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you. Okay, so, and thank you again to the board for allowing us to move that item up on the agenda. The next item that we have on the agenda is also very important, and it is our action item. Brian Kelleher will present the 2021 mid-year budget updates for the authority and the Congestion Management Agency. So Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Geringer and Commissioners. Let me get this set up for you real quick. So tonight I'm here to present the mid-year budget. If we were to take a look back 1 year when we were doing our mid-year budget, last fiscal year, it's been a whole year that we've been going through this pandemic, and some of the biggest things, as we discuss with CCTA, is the allocation of sales tax dollars. So our budget method typically begins with the budget process of updating the delivery of the CCTA expenditure plan, and we update it from year to year. And at mid-year, we come back to the board and talk about the changes that we have, some new activities. And concurrently right now, I'm also starting the next year's fiscal budget. And so when we present to you in June, the regular fiscal budget, there's a lot of things that can happen. There could be delays. There could be some projects that are executed a little more quickly than expected. For example, the 680 project and the Highway 4 680 project move a little bit quicker last year due to some construction commitments made by the contractors. And so some of those deductions are being made here. We'll get through that as we move through. And so when we started the fiscal year budget last year for the 2020-2021 fiscal year budget, which we're looking at right now, we thought sales tax was going to increase about 14-18% between last fiscal year and this fiscal year. But as we all know, and we've all seen in our individual cities in the county, is sales tax revenue for Contra Costa County has exceeded expectations. We're running about the same as we were the year before, if not a little better. People are staying home, people are buying things, people are buying cars, people are doing home improvements. So a combination of a number of different things are happening here in Contra Costa. We're more of a commuter county. There's a lot of individuals that live in Contra Costa. It's about 1.1 million. And so they're spending their money on sales tax. And that's really good for CCTA in delivering our projects. And so when we budgeted last year, we thought it would come down to about $76.5 million. But the actual sales tax that we received for July 2020 through December 2020 sales tax is $52.5 million. And when I presented this to APC, there was a great question. Well, after 6 months, you're getting 52 million. How come you're not going to get 104 million after the next 6 months? There's a timing of payments that come in. There's the shopping habits. There's a lot of economic things. And the holiday season in October through December is always much higher than it is in the other quarters. And so based on the projections, we always see anywhere from $42 to $45 million in the January through June side. So in working with HDL, our sales tax consultant, they're feeling very strong that we're going to have about $95 million, if not a little bit more. And so staff continues to monitor all of the sales tax information. I meet with HDL on a quarterly basis. We look at short-term presentations in regards to what we think is going to happen in the next 6 months. And we're also looking what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And so just a little information, we're looking at possibly maybe a 4% increase for next year, but there's still so many things that can happen regionally throughout the state and nationally as well. And so we'll be developing a long-range financial plan this summer. that Hisham and his team will work to do the next expenditure plan update, the strategic plan for 2021. And so with that, I'm going to go through just the overall changes in the budget. So the biggest item we discussed was the sales tax revenues. That's increasing $18.5 million. But what's always a number that changes a lot and fluctuates is the federal, state, and local revenues. So we have a lot of capital projects. We go out and we get grants for these projects. We come to the board throughout the years and we get resolutions and contracts that you guys authorize for us to get the work done. And then it's a timing of getting all the studies done and all the capital projects done. And then once we get invoiced by the consultants, we pay the consultants, and then we in turn have to do reimbursements to get paid for these commitments that are made. And so the federal, state, and local revenues is about $67 million. Our investment income, interest rates have decreased over the last year. Our investment amount has decreased in the last year only because we're drawing down and fulfilling the commitments of the strategic plan. Our other sources is the accumulation of finance resources from year to year. So when we collect sales tax in this year, some projects aren't going to be built for several years. So when Measure J started, we started collecting sales tax. There's an accumulation of sales tax that goes into each individual pot of the 1% of the sales tax money we get. And then it's delivered in future years. And so we're using those prior dollars that we've collected to deliver these projects. And so here we get to the project section. You can see there's a decrease of $25 million. And again, that's just the timing of projects. There's a delivery during last fiscal year that was ramped up a little faster. We had some Innovate 680 projects that got deferred a little bit to next fiscal year. So it's always a timing issue. The program section is a collection of sales tax, and for what we collect, we divvy out to the individual projects and programs. A good example is the local street and maintenance. We collect money, about 20% goes back to the individual cities in the county. And so as sales tax revenues go up, so does our contribution for these programs. The planning section had a minor decrease of about $108,000. Administrative section is a small decrease of about $140,000, and debt service is remaining the same. We have debt service schedules that remain the same, and there's timely payments, and so we use that to budget. And so as we discuss sales tax, there's always a great discussion on sales tax because that's what pays for all of these projects and programs. So I'm going to skip over this really quickly. So back in 2019, we saw $96 million. In 2020, we saw $93.5 million. And so now, based off of the projections that we're seeing, we're going to have a sales tax revenue of about $95 million for this year. And again, we've already collected about $52 million. And so as we look at the capital projects, there's always the funding side that I discussed. So as we break down the funding sources, and then on one of the other slides, there's a breakdown of each project and where all these funding sources are going. So just in general, just a basic overview, RM2, RM3, we're seeing a small deduction of $1.2 million. And in there was probably about $2.5 million for the McCollum Trail that was earmarked as RM3, but that project's not going to be built this year, and the construction is not going to start this year. So that's being deferred to next fiscal year. The beta funds, the federal, the SLP, the STIP, and the ECRFA, that's all a timing of projects and when we think we're going to have some of the expenditures done so that we can seek reimbursement. And we'll go over that as we look at the individual slides. And also outside the capital program, we have some planning revenues that come in. So we get about $1.2 million of federal funds for the Planning and Congestion Management Authority. We also have some PPM funds for the delivery of projects, $355,000, and that looks for the next couple fiscal years about exactly the same amount. And then on the CMA side, we also collect from all the local jurisdictions a portion of what it costs to build that program, and it's about $130,000 this year. And so we also have some revenues that come in for the program section, which is about $1.7 million. And that's based off the motor vehicle registration. And Peter helps with all the individual committees to create projects and programs on that and deliver it. And then the city of San Ramon is working with Ivan to build a bridge out there. And so we're getting reimbursed from them. So there's a contribution from them to work on the Iron Horse Trail overcrossing. And so as I kind of discussed a little bit earlier, here's our major 9 categories for the CIP program. And about 42.5% of the sales tax money goes to these individual programs. And that's to cover debt service and also cover the Measure J commitments for each of these programs. And so when we go out and we do these construction projects, we don't have enough money to pay for it. So we get these external grants. And so as we look at the SR4 East widening, you can see that we have about a $1.5 million contribution from RM2. And as you go through this, you can look at the I-680 SR4 interchange improvement. There's about a $30 million contribution from the state. And then as we're working on the I-680 corridor, the HOV lane, and also the Innovate 680, it looks like we have a number of different pots of money that are help paying for this. And if you look to the far right, the Measure J programs, again, these are multi-year capital projects. And so the timing of revenue and the timing of expenditures, they always fluctuate a little bit. So last year we had a lot of expenditures, and now we're starting to collect the revenue on that, and we're budgeting for it in this fiscal year. And we also have in the other category, we have a $6.5 million contribution from the Tri-Valley Transportation Commission, and that should be coming in by the end of the fiscal year. And then here we have the commitments from $100 million when we originally brought the budget to you back in June to where we think they're going to be now, which is $75 million. And you can see the deductions on the individual projects. And so the big one that sticks out is the I-680 corridor. A lot of the billing was done last fiscal year. Some timing of the Innovate 680 is being pushed back to next year. And so there's a decrease of about $17.2 million. And so in addition to the capital program and the planning, and there's also the administration of delivering the Measure J programs. And so in the strategic plan, and it allocates 1% for the salaries and benefits for administrative people. So when we have people like myself, a portion of my time is working in administration, a portion of my time is working on the capital program, a portion is working in planning. And so with all the costs for the individuals at CCTA, it's going to be about $700,000, and it represents about 0.74% of the 1% limitation. So we're clearly under the 1% limitation. And then also in the administrative department, the general overhead for CCTA, which pays our leases and pays all the general attorney fees and all of those things. Now that we're all working from home, we're not in the office as much. There's a number of supplies and services that we're not utilizing that we don't need. So there's a cost savings for this fiscal year, which is about $25,000. Travel, staff's not attending all these meetings. They're using Zoom for these meetings. And so there's a reduction of about $60,000. And as we all miss the board meetings and getting together and having a bite to eat and talking over dinner, there's a reduction. There's no meetings that we need to order food for. So that's $12,500. And then I'll be replacing one of the servers for the information systems infrastructure that's necessary to continue. That's going to be in the range of $25,000 to $30,000. So there's an increase there on that side. And so with the many changes that we've had and the additions of staff members and a couple of employees that retired last year, there's a reduction on the salaries and benefits overhead. Now there's only 18 individuals working for CCTA projected between now and June. And with that, there's a cost savings of about $300,000. As you know, Tim took over for Randy. Currently, his position is not backfilled, so there's a savings there of 6 months' salary. And so also, as I presented the comprehensive annual financial report to you back in January, the OPEB, which is a liability like our pension, we're overfunded $420,000 as of 2019. We had some great interest earnings and recoveries in the last fiscal year. So that number has increased even more. And we'll be working with an outside consultant to take a look at that. And as the agency continues to continue into the future, those liabilities will continue to increase as well. And so every 2 years, we take a look at it, and we need to take a look at our funding status and kind of see where we are. And right now, we're putting in about 9.9%. And so I've reduced that to 2%. And so for the remaining payrolls in this fiscal year, we're going to see about $100,000 reduction. And as I'm working on next year's fiscal year budget, that'll be probably about $200,000 savings next year. So the programs department, as we discussed, there's a lot of allocation of sales tax money that we collect during this year. There's also some money that we've saved up for the ferry service, the TLC, the ped bike, and also the bus services and the alternatives for paratransit. They all get a percentage of the sales tax that we collect every year. I work with Peter in the programs division to allocate funds and make payments to these vendors. As I discussed, it's about $19 million for 20% of the sales tax return to source funds. And then several program budgets were revised to reflect current commitments and current projects that they're working on. So in the planning department, which also has the CMA function, expenditures decreased to reflect current contracted services associated with the growth management, action planning, and monitoring the deliverables. There were some expenditures that were decreased related to salaries and benefits due to some of the savings that we had just talked about. And several contracts and studies are partially funded by grant revenues. Again, debt service is going to remain the same, about $42 million. And of that, about $20 million is going to be paid principal to draw that down. And so with that, that concludes my presentation, and staff seeks approval and recommendation for us to make the adjustments to the mid-year budget. Any questions?
Thank you, Brian. And are there any questions from any of the commissioners or representatives? Okay, and Terry Ann, do we have any public comment if there are any members of the public who wish to ask a question or comment?
I don't see any public comment.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve Resolution 20-17A Revision 1 to update the changes to the fiscal 2020-21 budget?
So
Madam
moved.
Chair, I would move the item.
Okay, I think Commissioner Nowak was there, so I will take that as a second from Commissioner Glover. So Terry Ann, we have a motion by Commissioner Nowak and a second by Commissioner Glover. Will you please call the roll?
Yes, Commissioner Arnrich,
Yes.
Commissioner Butt,
Yes.
Commissioner Glover,
Yes.
Commissioner Haskew,
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchoff,
Yes.
Commissioner Nowak,
Yes.
Commissioner Thorpe.
Aye.
Thank you. Commissioner White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Geringer.
Yes,
Motion passes unanimously.
thank you. And Brian, thank you very much. I'm looking around. There you are on the screen. Thank you very much for the updates and for all the work that you do relative to keeping us fiscally sound. So moving on to our next agenda item, we have an action item presented by Hishan Noemi on the project nominations for the Safe and Seamless Mobility Quick Strike Program. And Hishan, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, Madam Chair and the 30 members. Last month, the Authority Board approved the rank list of the remaining Measure J projects in the strategic plan and the TLC PID bike programming documents. As you recall, we had to rank these projects to prepare for potential declines in our revenues due to COVID-19 and to allow us to direct our limited Measure J funds in a way that leverages the most in state and federal funds. Staff presented two lists to you at the time, a list of 32 locally sponsored Measure J projects and another 11 authority managed projects. The local list needed about $43 million in Measure J funds, and you approved resuming appropriations up to $11 million for the top 14 projects on that local list. You also approved continuing the suspension of Measure J appropriations to the remaining 18 projects, which need about $32 million, until you adopt a new long-range revenue forecast, which is expected later in the year, maybe around June. As part of your approval, you indicated that we will give the remaining Measure J projects on the ranked list a higher priority for future state and federal funds we get to recommend programming for. We now have such an opportunity to fund some of the remaining 18 local projects with federal funds. MTC adopted the guidelines on how to program these additional federal money in late January. They called it the Safe and Seamless Mobility Quick Strike Program. Our share of that is about $7 million, but there is no guarantee that we will get our share, since MTC will be the entity evaluating and selecting the projects. This type of process is new to us, since in the past, MTC will just issue the guidelines, tell us what our share is, and then let CCTA board select the projects that best meet the criteria. They're not doing that anymore because they had an audit finding from FHWA that criticized the way they did business in the old days, where things were done more by formula. To improve our chances of getting our share, we need to submit more than the $7 million in funding requests. Staff reviewed all the remaining 18 projects on the locally ranked list and contacted the sponsors over the past couple months to determine if their projects are eligible and if they can meet the MTC requirements. In summary, the guidelines limit eligible projects to pedestrian and bicycle projects, as well as projects that improve transit access. The project that receives the funding must advertise for construction bids by September 2022. For the full details on the requirements, we attach the guidelines to the staff report as attachment B. In terms of the schedule, MTC wants our nomination by the end of this month, and we will know which projects they picked about in May, June timeframe, in 2 to 3 months. After working with the project sponsors over the past month, we identified 6 projects on the ranked list that meet the criteria in the guidelines. To help improve our chances, we also identified 2 projects that were submitted in prior OBAG call for projects, but were not funded because we didn't have enough funding. MTC also asked us to nominate on their behalf the I-580 westbound general purpose lane conversion to an HOV. That project improved transit access to the Richmond San Rafael Bridge. That's a total of 9 projects, requesting $23.5 million in funding, which will put us in good position to get at least our $7 million share. Another reason we should submit more than our share is because there is a chance that MTC may use the list of projects we submit to program additional STP funds in the near future from the Corona Relief Bill, HR 133, even though no decisions have been made on that yet. That if they do that, that's possibly another $8 to $9 million we could get. With that, we are seeking your approval to nominate the projects in attachment A to MTC for the Quick Strike program. The APC discussed this item and recommended approval, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sham. Are there any questions or comments from authority board members? I see no hands up. Terry, and did we receive any written public comment on this item?
No, we have not received any written public comment.
Are there any members of the public in attendance who would like to speak to this item? If you would like to do so, if you will please raise your hand. And seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the nominated projects as included in attachment A?
So moved. So moved. Newell.
A second?
Second, Kelly.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Commissioner Arnrich and a second by Vice Chair Kelly. Terry Ann, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Arnrich,
Yes.
Commissioner Butt,
Yes.
Commissioner Glover,
Yes.
Commissioner Haskew,
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson,
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchoff,
Muted, Karen.
Mute, unmute. Yes, vote yes.
thank you. Commissioner Nowak,
Yes.
Commissioner Thorpe,
He left.
I let him back in. I don't know if he left. Did he leave again?
He's out.
Or maybe, you know what? I probably need to make him a co-host.
He's here. He's down
He's
the
back.
There he
bottom.
is.
He's back.
Sorry, he left. He
You
fell
need
off.
to unmute me. Okay, I'm unmuted.
There you go. All right,
Aye.
Commissioner Thorpe, thank you. Commissioner White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kelly,
Yes.
Chair Geringer,
Yes,
motion passes unanimously.
and thank you very much, Hisham.
Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on in our regular agenda to the Planning Committee items, our next item is another action item, and it will be introduced by Matt Kelly, and it's updates on the Measure J Growth Management Program Implementation Guide.
Good evening, Chair Geringer, thank you. And good evening to the authority members. I'm Matt Kelly. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner here at CCTA. I'm here tonight with David Early from PlaceWorks, the CCTA Planning On-Call consultant. Tonight, I'm here to summarize the proposed changes to the Growth Management Program Implementation Guide as directed by you, the board, in order to implement the changes from level of service to vehicle miles traveled in CEQA due to passage of Senate Bill 743. We know that most of you have seen this presentation or versions of this presentation at the RTPCs, but tonight we'll just provide a short overview of the proposed changes. And I'd like to use this opportunity to give a big thanks to the GMP task force members who represent most of your jurisdictions and transit agencies for all the time they contributed to this effort over the last 18 months. You may remember that in July 2020, the board approved the shift from level of service to VMT in the growth management program. Since that time, staff, the task force, and consultants have been working to reflect those changes in the implementation guide, which your local staffs use as guidance for remaining compliant with the GMP in order to continue to receive Measure J return to source funds. And a major focus of the revisions that we're addressing in the guide is how the action plans for routes of regional significance would work moving forward in this new paradigm of VMT. And we think the framework established in the guide will set the authority up well for the major effort of updating the countywide transportation plan in the coming years, which are based around the action plans, and which would then ultimately lead to a new expenditure plan. So it's exciting to get to this moment tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to David Early, who will walk us through the proposed changes. And I will
Great.
bring it up on my screen.
Thank you, Matt. I'm David Early with PlaceWorks. I know many of you, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. Matt and I are going to keep this pretty brief because we know that many of you have already seen this presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. First slide. So the big picture takeaway for this is that through the implementation guide, we're going to be moving from a single mode that you all have been assessing in your action plans. And that's always been regional roadways. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. And we're of course retaining that mode. Regional roadways remain very important, but we're also going to be moving into a system where action plans are going to be considering two other modes, the regional bicycle and pedestrian network, as well as the regional transit network. And they're also going to be considering three non-modal items, which are transportation safety, equity in transportation, and transportation effects on climate change. So action plans, which used to be required to only look at one item, which often looked at some other modes as well, but didn't always do so, are now going to be required to do all 6 of these items. You all who are also serving on RTPCs will continue to have the discretion to add topics above those 6 and also to establish the goals and actions that the action plans cover. So all of that remains the same, but you're going to be working on this larger group of 6 topics instead of just the previously required 1. Next slide. So on the modal side, those again are the roadway network, the regional bicycle and pedestrian network, and the regional transit network. And the updated implementation guide is going to mimic the current process for the roadways. RTPCs will continue to designate and map the routes. They'll do that now not only for roadways, but also for a complete sub-regional mapping of bicycle and pedestrian network and the transit network, including, for example, trunk bus lines, BART lines, ferry service, and other rail. RTPCs will map and designate those routes. Routes crossing over sub-regional boundaries will be discussed by the affected RTPCs to come to agreement on what the standard should be. And then each RTPC will continue to establish the goals, set the transportation objectives, and develop supportive actions regarding them. On the non-modal side, those won't be addressed at the level of individual facilities, such as a particular roadway or a bikeway, but instead we're going to be asking the RTPCs to set sub-region-wide or place-specific, such as a city goal for transportation equity, transportation safety, and reduction of greenhouse gases and addressing climate change as it applies to transportation. So each sub-region will again set its own standards and goals for each of those items. And our guidance does include examples of the kinds of transportation objectives that might be set in each of those 3 areas. Next slide. Our work does also include a update to the overall action process that's described in the implementation guide. That includes a particular focus on the process among RTPCs for shared facilities. And you can see circled in red on this flow chart is the part of the chart that explains how the RTPCs interact with each other as they prepare their action plans. We've also documented changes to the transportation impact evaluation process. That's a process that's laid out particularly for major projects that may not be consistent with an action plan or the RTP itself, and also with general plan amendments. GPAs need to be evaluated for compliance with the GMP when they're reviewed, and we've provided updated guidance on overall transportation impact analyses as well. There are implications of all this work for your CEQA evaluations. In the past, before SB 743, it was often the case that a project CEQA evaluation and a growth management program evaluation were pretty parallel to each other because they were both looking at capacity and level of service. That will no longer be the case. Roadway capacity and level of service on regional roadways will continue to remain an important component of the GMP. We know that it's very important to residents throughout the county that we maintain good levels of service. So you'll continue to be looking for compliance with the GMP and project evaluations, looking at capacity and level of service. However, you won't probably be doing that in a CEQA analysis because under CEQA, you're now required to look at VMT. So both processes will continue to exist, but they'll be a little more separate. The CEQA documents will cover VMT, while roadway capacity and level of service will be conducted in or covered in GMP evaluations. So Matt, do you want me to finish this up or do you want to take it over from here?
I'll wrap it up. Thank you, David. This just walks us through where we've been. We've been on a road tour to the tax boards of the RTPCs, the TCC. We've done approximately 50 some odd meetings since mid 2019 in order to get all this into shape. So it's been a lot of work, but tonight we're in front of you for approval. This would then lead us to update the sister document of the implementation guide, which are the technical procedures, which lay out the very technical details that your staffs and consultants use when doing technical analysis of projects. And then we will begin a VMT mitigation program development that is a grant funded by Caltrans. We'll be using members of the task force to serve as a guiding force on that effort. And then in the fall, we will begin updating the action plans at the RTPC level. We'll be providing consultant support for that. It will be at least a year-long effort that I mentioned will lead to the update of the countywide transportation plan, and then hopefully an expenditure plan following that. So this is really kicking off the next couple of years of work. Our recommendation tonight is approval of the revisions to the GMP implementation guide under resolution 2110G. And I can take any questions. Thank you. I'll stop my share.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments before we go to public comment? I have a comment, and Matt actually touched on it in the beginning. I really appreciate the work that's been done, and also the focus on the regional, looking at this across the regions and across the RTPCs, particularly as it relates to our routes of regional significance, and also on our hotspots. And so as we move forward on the action plans, I know there's a lot of work being done by staff to work with the RTPCs on the framework, and I very much appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to working together across jurisdictions as we move forward. So are there any public comments, Terry Ann?
I don't see any public comment, and no written public comment was received.
Thank you. Do I have a motion?
Move to approve.
Commissioner Haskew, motion. I see Commissioner Hudson as a second. And so Terry Ann, will you please do the roll call vote?
Commissioner Arnrich?
Yes.
Commissioner Butt?
Yes.
Commissioner Glover?
Yes.
Commissioner Haskew?
Yes.
Commissioner Hudson?
Yes.
Commissioner Mitchell?
Yes.
Commissioner Nowak?
Yes.
Commissioner Thor?
Aye.
Commissioner White?
Yes.
Vice Chair Geringer? I'm sorry, Vice Chair Kelly.
Kelly, yes.
Combine the last two. Vice Chair Kelly, sorry. And then Chair Geringer.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
And that's one way to speed up the so thank you, Terry Ann, and thank you, Matt and David, for that report. And I could say I'm going to be sorry not to see the presentation again, but thank you very much for all the work that's gone into that. Matt doesn't want to give it anymore, but thank you. So moving on to item number 10, correspondence and communications. We don't have any on that section. We do have a committee report that was provided in the handout packet for agenda item number 11 that Terry Ann provided to us today, along with some other items. Moving on to the authority board and staff comments. Chair comments and reports. I will say that I attended the CalCog meeting as an observer. I don't have a full report out on that. I also attended the California Transportation Foundation Forum yesterday morning. I did have to, I'm going to have to watch part of it because I did have to leave a little bit early. So I will provide an additional, a report out at the next meeting on that. It was very interesting and covered a lot of the topics that we've covered tonight in our meeting. So thank you for allowing me to attend that. And then moving on to commissioners and ex officio representatives' comments and reports on activities and meetings. Any comments from commissioners? I see a lot of shaking of heads. And any comments from representatives before I call on Representative Powers? Any comments from other representatives? Okay, so we do have Representative Powers did also attend the CTF forum yesterday, and I don't know if she wants to report out on that, but we would like to ask her to give an update on the transit collaboration plan, a brief update on that plan that was in our handout packet today. And I believe that it's going to be shared on the screen. And I believe Representative Powers was going to speak to this. Is she here? Do we have to unmute Representative Powers or?
No, she can unmute herself. I think she was having a little bit of connectivity issues. It looks like she's back with us. Are you here?
Yes, I am.
Great, thank you. Maureen, you want to give us a brief update on the United Front or a United Front amongst transit operators?
I don't know if it's a United Front or what, but you know, well, we just want to know what is going on, you know, for all of us.
Before anybody says it, I'm unmuted. So nothing in addition to what was presented in the packet. We can review that, and if we have questions, we can, or comments, we'll provide that. I do want to thank Lindsay Willis for creating this lovely two-pager or document on this particular item.
Right.
Thank you. So hearing no other reports, Lindsay, I think is the one share. Oh, Peter's sharing the screen. Peter, can you take that?
Yeah, I just wanted to present this. I think this was put into your packet to share. So Lindsay created this. There's the Blue Ribbon Task Force for the region is looking at several issues associated with transportation coordination, or transit coordination, I should say. And as Contra Costa operators, we thought, you know, we're already doing a lot of this, so let's put it down on paper and provide an opportunity, or provide a piece that we can, you know, provide not only the Blue Ribbon Task Force, but to you as members of the CCTA board and transit board members, to kind of show the different things that our operators are already doing for coordination. And so I just wanted to point out, you know, Lindsay has put together an amazing piece here with several, I think in the orange boxes, you can see the different kind of head topics. And then with each of those, the subcategories or actual activities that the transit operators are working together with. And this just isn't bus operations, it's coordination with BART as well in our county, and to kind of show what our bus operators are doing to collaborate both with the large operators, BART, and each other, and not only on service improvements, but also on efficient management and potentially you know, joint procurements and things like that. So we wanted to show this to you this evening. It's been developed in cooperation with the transit operators, and we're prepared to provide it to all of you, as well as anybody else, Blue Ribbon Task Force, anybody else that's prepared or, you know, willing to provide this information to your constituents.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
And so if you could, thank you very much also to Lindsay for putting that together. And I see Vice Chair Kelly has her hand raised.
Yeah, just real quickly, I just want to echo what Peter said. You know, there's a perception out there that in the Bay Area, we're all a whole bunch of small little transit agencies and we don't work together and we should all be combined into one. And I think here in Contra Costa County, several of us have made the point that we do work together quite a bit. And so I'm very grateful for Lindsay for putting all this together, and for all the transit operators to coming together and share, and to continuing to share what we do and look for solutions. So thank you very much. This is a great piece.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And,
thank you, Chair Kelly.
Thank you. And and then I also see that Chris Peoples has his hand up. And Terry, is he unmuted? Able to unmute himself?
Yeah, I just sent him the request.
Okay.
Unmute. There we go.
Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to Lindsay. That's a great piece. I'm going to go back to AC Transit and figure out why we're not included in it. We about 11% of our service occurs in the West County area, and I think we're probably the largest provider in the county, although I'm not sure of that. I just wanted to comment that part of the piece talks about zero emission work, and that's great. You should know that AC Transit has been running zero emission buses for 20 years, and we're considered one of the world leaders. And we've just started a program where we're comparing our older fuel cell buses, which are fuel cell dominant, our newer ones, which are battery dominant, with our battery electric buses, our diesel buses, and our hybrid buses. And that study should be out in about 6 months. It's being run by NREL and by a professor of engineering from Stanford.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, this is really astonishing, and we need to make it's fantastic that we are the forerunners for this world. It's really important.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Powers. So if there are no other commissioner and ex officio representative reports, we will move on to our executive staff comments, and our executive director, who took the not the call, sort of the call to action at the end of the last meeting to say it will be on March 17th and we will all be wearing green, and took it very seriously. And I very much appreciate staff getting their backgrounds and things like that, and Tim taking it all the way all the way. So go for it, Tim.
Thank you, Chair Geringer, appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. It's, in January, I spent a lot of time with staff, and in February, I spent a lot of time with all of you, really to get to know all of you a little bit more. And it's really astonishing, all the great work that we're doing and talking with all of you. Through your support, your leadership, we're able to develop some of the most innovative mobility solutions that we've been working on, both locally, regionally, and then now working towards globally. Reputation. And so through advanced technologies, mobility on demand, automated driving systems, I mean, these are all things that are really setting the pace for the future to really help meet our goals to develop an integrated, accessible, sustainable transportation system for all. And so I think something that's really important about that, and it's really been demonstrated tonight through a lot of pieces of work, is really the collaboration and the partnerships. And so one of my goals is really enhanced collaboration. And something that I really enjoy about Contra Costa and CCTA is really how we can all come together and work together towards common goals. And that's, again, because of really your support and leadership. And, that was also illustrated, through a lot of the work that we've heard through the Accessible Transportation Strategic Plan. It's really exciting to see how our public transit operators, our private transit operators, our community partners can work together and really plan and implement, really a customer-focused mobility for all. And as you all know, this work is super critical, in our county. We have a growing aging population with people with disabilities. And this is also illustrated through, we talked a little bit about that handout right now, but we don't tell people enough what we're doing. That's something that's kind of our own fault, but this is something that we want to do more of. Lindsay is working on a communications plan, and we really want to get out there and tell the community, tell the people what we're doing, all the exciting things we're doing, and really be transparent about the great work that we're doing to really provide a customer-focused system to the public. And I think we've also have great partnerships with our federal delegation. So we virtually met with our federal delegation with Chair Geringer and Vice Chair Kelly. And I think through those meetings, it's really clear that our vision aligns with their vision. And it's really great to hear that, because I'm sure you've all been heard that there's going to be potential earmarks, and we've received the guidance for that, and staff is putting together a proposal to share with our congressional members. And that's something that I'll be sending more information about this as it becomes available to all of you. And I think also our private partners, because of our reputation, we've been working with some of the most innovative companies, in the world. And one in particular that's just recently approached us is Glideways. And this is a company that provides dynamic personal microtransit. Really, it's a little pod that's about 6 feet wide. It holds about 1 to 2 people. It really moves people very efficiently. And because of, again, the things that we're able to do and come together and work towards common goals, our partners out in East Contra Costa are working on a feasibility study to really leverage this technology to provide better first and last mile connectivity and support transit recovery in East Contra Costa. And so I was able to attend their workshop a few weeks ago and was really excited to hear the progress they're making on that. And I'll just close it. It's just, again, it's really exciting to see how all these pieces are working together towards our common vision and goals. And it's really because of your support, your leadership, and really the awesome staff we have here at CCTA. And it's really exciting to see this, and it's going to be exciting to see how we can pull all this together into probably one of the most innovative countywide transportation plans as we kind of launch into that later this year. So that concludes my comments, and appreciate the opportunity, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Tim. And anybody have any questions or comments for our executive director? And Tim, just thank you, and thank you to the whole team. I didn't mention that I got to crash the all-staff meeting on Monday, and just very impressed with the energy and enthusiasm that everybody puts into, and their list of things, but just the enthusiasm and energy that they put into all that they do. So moving on to 13, your calendars are provided in your packet. And unless there's anything else for the good of the order, we will adjourn our meeting at 7:37, and we will, hopefully I will see you before, but we will be back together as a body on April 21st. And we're adjourned.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Night.